go. Come on up.
Good morning. Yeah, good morning, everyone. I'm excited to be here. I know after a lot of last night's events, getting up for an 8:30 session is a bit challenging. So I certainly appreciate you all being here, and I hope there's some tidbits that you can glean for your security programs, your risk management programs, and some of the kind of ideas and topics that I bring to attention here will be of insight. So let me start first just with a little disclaimer. I'm not going to read this out loud, but just wanted to pause here for a moment before we dig into the actual content. All right, so I wanted to start out with just a bit of a topical introduction. Obviously, you saw third-party risk management on there. I know I'm in a room full of risk management professionals and security practitioners, so I'm not overly going to define third-party risk management, but I did want to talk to logic and why third-party risk management matters. So let me maybe just start first with a question for the audience. How many of you have over 1,000 third parties as part of your ecosystem? Just raise your hand. I'm just curious here. Okay, how about 5,000? Yeah, it's interesting to see that. More than 10,000? Yeah. And I mean, we could probably ask the question at 20,000, 30,000. I mean, there's probably some very large vendor relationships. So let me kind of, the why it matters, I think is pretty self-explanatory here. Our third parties bring us lots of risks. Some of those risks are related to security. Some of those can be operational. There's lots of various risk profiles that apply to third parties. And the scale at which third party relationships have been growing is particularly challenging. So I wanted to start out kind of illustrating the why through some of the challenges that third-party risk management as a profession faces. First on here, compounding vendorization. So fourth-party relationships. Going back probably 8 to 10 years ago, this was like a hot topic. And it continues to be a more complex and more challenging topics for third-party risk practitioners. So just as a challenge to our industry, fourth-party relationships, fifth-party relationships, that continues to compound. Secondly, increased volume. I had lots of people raising their hands at 10,000. I had a few people kind of nodding that they have way more than that. So I think that those numbers have only gone up over time, and I only expect them to go up over time. So kind of the why it matters here is there's going to be more of it. Increasingly complex third-party relationships. Again, going back 5 to 10 years, third-party relationships were a bit more straightforward. They're only, as business evolves, third-party relationships evolve in kind, and those relationships become more complex. Again, that makes our job as risk practitioners, as security practitioners, more challenging. Lastly, internal. For third-party risk management, there's often a lot of coordination points with other functions, procurement, maybe a privacy team, maybe a legal team. And that coordination and the lack of awareness or awareness across your company is a challenge that we face as practitioners. You know, all business units can procure vendors. You need to have awareness of these programs. And considering the 3 points above, having that awareness that's scalable and changing through the complexities of third parties is very important. The last challenge is evolving regulatory requirements. This is something that probably everybody in this room has been challenged with throughout their careers, that the rules change and the perspectives on the rules change, and how do we integrate those rules into a third-party risk management program or any security program. These are all challenges that, again, are very specific to third-party risk management, but they probably could also be applied to other risk management or security functions. So the idea is the challenge landscape here is very large, and the idea that I'm going to be talking about today is, in part, we can solve those challenges through the idea of logic. And kind of a secondary ideology here is that as an industry, we rely too heavily on judgment. Judgment is a great thing, judgment is a powerful thing, but we should be focused on when we use it and rely on logic when we can use logic. So, I wanted to define logic in a bit more detail. I kind of think like a coder, so you can kind of see my if-then statement here. but the idea of logic is using a decision tree as part of your risk management function to help drive a decision. So if then is kind of the best way to illustrate that in my coding language, but the idea, the broader idea of logic here is allows us to focus judgment on high value unique decision points and remove judgment on low value repetitive decision points. That's the idea here, and that's kind of the topic that I want to dig into in detail. All right, so before we dig into that in detail, I do want to hit a couple learnings that I've had as I've applied this to a number of the companies that I've worked at. One is identity. Before you can apply logic, you need to know your identity. And this, it seems simple, right? It's like, you know, on your title, it can say third-party risk management. It can say risk management. But all of you know, once you get into your company and once you try to understand what the true ethos of your team is, or kind of the company's overall approach to handling risk management, to handling third-party risk management, maybe you just have one profile in that. Maybe you have all of that. But truly trying to understand your identity, are we a comprehensive program, or are we very focused on one profile in third-party risk management? And you can kind of see like operational compliance, security, financial, like a lot of these things are often done by different teams, or sometimes they're all done by one team. But truly understanding that is critical for defining key logic. Like the working example would be here, if compliance is part of the risk profiles that your team is responsible for, you're going to want to have some logic questions around things like GDPR, right? But if you're a focused TPRM team, alternatively, you can understand specifically what you care about, and it's easier to define logic. Certainly comprehensive, you can do it too. The logic decision trees just become more complex. So let me just kind of ask a question here, and it doesn't have to be specific to TPRM. Raise your hand if your risk management function is comprehensive. It covers multiple risk profiles. Okay, seeing a few hands. Yeah, it looks like about half. How about specific? Like maybe your team only covers one specific profile. Yeah, I'd say a little bit less. Yeah, and this is always, when I started a company and I'm trying to understand a company, this is where I start. I truly try to understand the team I'm on, the programs that exist in the company, where are the coordination points, and what is my team's identity? And a lot of the examples that we're going to go through here shortly are going to be focused on the security risk profile. But again, they apply to all these risk profiles. It's just security is where I'm going to be giving my working examples. Okay, second prerequisite. This one's very important. I think it's self-explanatory, but it's so important that I wanted to illustrate it before we dig into the logic piece. One is understanding your company's risk appetite. This is something that we all say, this is something that we all know, but to actually do it, to actually truly understand your company's risk appetite, I don't find that to be easy. I feel like as an industry, we talk about this like it's just an easy thing to do. It's something that's just embedded in all of us, but I don't find that to be true in practice. And truly understanding it is critical to defining good logic. If you don't understand it, the ideals that I'm about to present don't apply as perfectly as they could. So how do we understand it? Integrating maybe with other risk management functions, other compliance functions, truly trying to understand how are they looking at risk, coordinating on that, meeting with your executives, really understanding the ethos of your company is critical to getting this right. And it's, again, it's very challenging, and I think it's underrepresented in the challenge that it actually presents. And it also changes over time. So you constantly want to be on that pulse. Like, do we care about the right things? If your topic's security, are we focused on the things that matter most, the data sets that matter most, the products that matter most? Without this, you can't build good logic. You need to understand your company's position on risk. So the idea here, kind of bringing it back to logic, is when done right, you can focus judgment on your kind of higher value propositions, and you can focus less judgment on maybe the lower value propositions in part, and you can know that you're right when you're applying it. That's the key piece here. You can build out logic that serves privacy, that serves legal, that serves security, but to truly do it with understanding your company, you can do it right. you can understand that the procedures you're performing are aligned to the value propositions and the values that your company has. So again, the key takeaway here is not to underestimate how challenging this is, and truly understanding it takes time. It takes meeting people from all over your company and really digging in workshops, be my advice. Okay, so let's talk about logic here a little bit. So again, I have my definition up there, and I wanted to apply this to a very specific process so we can work through some illustrative examples so that I can demonstrate it to you and then hopefully articulate the value proposition that it can bring your programs. So the workflow that I'm going to break down is third-party onboarding. So I'm sure everybody has their own spin on this, but a very standard spin on it is you do a level of inherent risk assessment to understand the inherent risk that third party brings to your company. You do a little bit of a due diligence assessment or audit procedures to understand what controls are in place at your company and the third party to truly identify residual risk. And then you report on that. You report to the third party so that they can remediate findings. You report to your executive management team so that they can make decisions. You report to the business team that's procuring the vendor. Very, very kind of standard life cycle here. And the most important part of this slide, and we're about to illustrate, is where input-based decisions, AKA logic, bring high value to a process, and where risk-based decisions bring high value to a process. So the thesis that I'm about to lay out is in the inherent risk assessment process, input is the key. Input is the faster way to do it and the more effective way to do it. But when you're reporting and when you're sharing your ideas and your findings and your procedures with other departments, with other companies, bringing it back to risk is the critical component. That's kind of a topology that maybe your company has defined, so it's easier to share that with executives. But in the operations, input allows you to apply logic, and logic is a quicker way to get through the work and a more thoughtful way to get through the work. Okay, so we're gonna dig into some details. This is a bit of an eye chart, but I have a value of what I'm defining here as a low value repetitive scenario. You can see the finance department is onboarding consultants that will have access to the facilities. And again, it doesn't have to be the finance department. I'm sure all of your companies hire consultants that are on site. And the idea here is there's a question in your inherent risk assessment for consultants. Do they get access to the facilities? Yes or no? If yes, that's the input. Here are the procedures that you perform. If no, no procedures performed relative to this input. So again, this question around consultants getting access to the company's facilities is one of a series of input questions that you would ask as part of your kind of inherent risk assessment. And this question would have its own set of due diligence procedures. Now, the alternative is a risk-based approach, right? So like you go through the inherent risk assessment, you ask those same questions, maybe you ask them a little bit differently, but you render a risk score, and that maybe is like a high, medium, or low. And then for the high, you do A, B, and C. The medium, you do X, Y, Z, so on and so forth. But it's based on maybe 3, 4, 5 risk tiers. This idea is based upon the input to one question, and certainly there will be other questions, but all the answers to those questions will feed effectively an audit plan that your analyst or team member could go out and execute against. Again, it's not based upon the overall risk, it's based upon the input. And when we were first building this out, it feels wrong to say that, right? It feels wrong not to say that it's not based on risk, it's based on input. Certainly all the inputs overall correlate to a risk statement, right? Like we can take all the inputs and say 5 yeses and 3 nos is a medium. But the idea is the overall risk is just for us to talk to the company's taxonomy. It's not to define our procedures. Our procedures are defined by logic at the input level. So again, if yes, this is what we're gonna do relative to consultants having access to company facilities. If no, we don't need to do these procedures at all, at least relative to this question. And certainly there may be other questions that bring those procedures into play. Okay, So a few kind of considerations here in this example that are just kind of specific to the scenario, but you'll kind of see them throughout the kind of the in greater ideal. So the first is, you can see my on point 2 there, DDAP, so this is due diligence assessment procedures, the terminology, it would be flagged for a broader question. Certainly this wouldn't be the only question that you would ask the third party, but it'd be one of a series of questions. So again, you would have logic that says, if we say yes to this question, we're going to generate a question for our questionnaire that's going to go to the third party, and it's going to include that question right there. Do you guys complete background checks? And there will be a number of other questions embedded into that questionnaire based upon yeses and nos to the other inherent risk assessment questions that you're asking. Secondly, you can kind of see some other pieces of this process that could be automated as well. One of which is kind of sending an email to the finance department that tells them their responsibilities in the third-party process. What do you do when you're offboarding your third parties? You know, do you have to escort them around the site? All of this stuff we can build into automation, and the idea here is it takes a lot of judgment out of the process because the work program goes and the outputs themselves can be automated through even just kind of simple workflow. Yeah, and you can see point 5 there is kind of the point on automation. As you mature this, and it takes some fine tuning to get these logic questions right. Again, you're constantly asking yourself, does this align to my identity? Does it align to my company's risk appetite? If yes, then you can start kind of automating this. You can mature your process in a way, but my working experience is like, you really want to test this out for 3 to 6 months to kind of tune, am I doing this right? Am I doing too much? And then you can keep playing with the variables till you get it right, and then start focusing on things like automation. Okay, so let me kind of just give another hypothetical scenario here. The idea here is, okay, we have maybe what I'm considering a low value transaction for my company, but it is a bit unique. So the idea here is that we are installing biometrics on a small server room. It's unique because the logic that I built out doesn't have a question specific to biometrics, but maybe biometrics bring a very specific risk that we want to focus on. So in this case, the goal is to make this low value and repetitive. Like, what can we learn from this review of a biometrics company? How should we be assessing them? Again, based upon our identity, based upon our company's risk appetite, and then documenting that and putting that into the calculator. So effectively, we would assign a more experienced team member here. The team member would understand the very specific risk, again, associated with our profiles for this type of transaction, and add that to the decision tree. We're constantly building out the decision tree and kind of teasing it to make sure that it aligns with the company's the risk values. So as kind of a starting point for this type of activity, we would find commonality in our existing logic, right? So, you know, we'd be sharing employee sensitive personal information with the biometrics vendor, and therefore we could probably leverage some of the playbook from our other third-party transactions that we're sharing sensitive personal information. There are a lot of things that also make a biometrics company similar to other companies, even if they're not doing biometrics, right? What are you sharing with them? Is that the same? So our more experienced practitioner would take a look at this and ask themselves, okay, what can I leverage from our existing decision tree, so I'm not wholly creating new procedures, and then just augment additional procedures on top of that, plus having the right input questions. So if it is a biometrics company, here's the next step in the decision tree. So kind of the key takeaways from these type of transactions is you're trying to make them repetitive, and you're trying to document your logic through judgment, right? You're gonna have an experienced team member working on this. They're gonna apply judgment. They're gonna document the inputs to that judgment, and that just increases the value of your logic calculator. I don't have this illustrated on the slide here, but a question that you may have, it's like, okay, like where does this logic exist? Is it just in everybody's head? Like how do we actually do this? And I really think there's an opportunity in this landscape to really integrate with like a GRC tool. That's how we do it. So it's like, we would ask the inherent risk assessment question, and if the answer is yes or no, then it would pull out the procedures. Those procedures would be one of many procedures that align with other questions and answers in the inherent risk assessment. But tooling really does help here is the point. Okay, so let's look at another idea here. So the idea here is high value. So again, the transaction is of high value with this third party, but it is repetitive. So we do have existing logic to deal with these high value but repetitive transactions. So the scenario here that I have is your HR department's hiring a new company to administer retirement accounts. So again, I'm just pulling out a couple questions from our inherent risk assessment. Will they be receiving employee PII? In this case, it's pretty self-explanatory for that type of transaction. And then how will we be sharing it? So now what you can see here as compared to the low value and repetitive, the nature of our procedures here are very light. It's, we're asking a question, we're notifying the finance department of their responsibilities, right? These are very important things to do, but they don't take my team a lot of time to do because it's purely things that we can automate, or it's the sharing of information, in this case, reviewing one question as well. But here, because it is high value and it's also repetitive, we have very clearly defined procedures and we're spending more time. So this is where the team's time is going. This is where we're really gonna beat up the third-party engagement with security procedures. And I wanted to hit on the first point in the due diligence assessment procedures here. Said specific questions to the third party regarding data sensitivity, transmission, retention, destruction. And you could have kind of a set of topics that align to the inherent risk assessment question. But the idea is that those topics align to actually specific questions that you would ask when you say yes to that first question. And again, those questions auto-generate into a questionnaire. So you're not asking your third parties to fill out a full SIG or a full cake. You're very specific to the input. And again, this is going to be one of lots of questions that maybe get put in there depending on the yeses and nos that you get. But you're asking the questions that matter. You're not asking the questions that don't matter. They're very curated to the input, which in this case is, are we sharing PII with them? And also they're based upon the kind of the risk appetite of the company. So anyway, you're going to have questions that feed the questionnaire that has questions from other inputs. Again, given the higher value here, we want to see some level of third-party assurance on validation of the existence of these controls. So maybe it's a SOC 2 report, an ISO certification. We want to see that validation. And then lastly, because it's high value and we're not spending as much of our time on the low value transactions, we're digging in and beating up the API that we're connecting to share this retirement information. So again, we're spending a lot of time here, but it's intentional. It's the right thing for our team to be focused on because we've aligned with the company's risk appetite, and the logic builds all of that out. It's not we get to the step and what do we do? Once you put in the yes, we know exactly what we do, and on top of that, we allow our practitioners to have judgment in the process, but the process is prescribed. That's the idea. Okay, let's look at a high value and unique scenario here. So I'm sure I was trying my best not to talk about artificial intelligence because I feel like every session just kind of throws that topic in to get people hooked. And I failed. I don't want to talk about it too much, but just to demonstrate that this is maybe a high value but unique proposition. Maybe we haven't worked with an artificial intelligence vendor before. The same ideals apply from the low value and unique. We want to try to get this to be repetitive. We want to try to understand what's our standard playbook for artificial intelligence. So you're going to assign, or you're going to want to assign, an experienced practitioner. And maybe for something like this, you want to also work collaboratively cross-functionally. Maybe it's the first time you're seeing it as a company. So certainly that has benefits so that you're building out kind of a coordinated attack plan. But the idea is you assign an experienced team member. That experienced team member truly understands kind of the risk. And again, we're focused on the security risk profile. So the security risk profiles that type of artificial intelligence vendor would bring, they ask themselves, what are the input questions that we need to do to ultimately define where we want to look at residual risk? They build that into the logic tree. Again, you probably should have some sort of governance around updating the logic tree, and then that gets programmed into your GRC tool. So the next time one of your practitioners picks up a third-party security review that's dealing with artificial intelligence, the playbook already exists, right? And I know probably a lot of you are thinking to yourselves like, we don't even have time to just get through all the work. How are we going to build out this logic tree? And that is a very valid concern. It takes the investment up front. I've seen the fruits of that, but I also know that it does put a short-term burden on the team to get something like this stood up. My position is that the long-term value is there, but it is something that, as security practitioners, there is no shortcoming on time. Okay, so a few other considerations here. Anytime we're in a situation that we think we provide high value, we want to meet with people. We don't want to automate things. We want to get out there. We want to meet with our business. We want to meet with our third parties. Like, we really want to demonstrate that we've got a finger on the pulse of value here. And our security practitioners, our talented personnel are out there meeting with these third parties. They're meeting with our business to truly break down the risk. One, so we get our logic right, but two, this is where we bring our value proposition to the company. This is where we, again, we're intentionally spending our time here because this matters. We know that this matters. Why? Because we've aligned to the risk, and we certainly know security risk, and we feel like maybe this transaction presents a high level of security risk. So again, when we're building out the calculator, my experience is that we don't always have to start from scratch. Even if we're dealing with something like an artificial intelligence provider, there's going to be commonalities and themes with how we do business with other product integrations in this case. And we can leverage some of the things that we have, and then that the curation of the decision tree doesn't need to be holistic. It doesn't have to foundationally change it. It typically just needs to supplement it. And certainly there are examples where, you know what, you might have to create a full new decision branch, and that results in more work. So the last point I wanted to kind of hit here, and I know I keep beating on this, but it's very important. Anytime we're using logic, the goal is to learn from the last transaction. So you really, the first time you get an artificial intelligence vendor in this case, you really want to put an experienced practitioner on it so that you can get the logic built into your process so that the next time you hit it, you're not asking yourself, hey, what did we do the time before? And it's easier to do it through logic than it is the application of risk. That's another learning that I've had. When you make it a logic equation, it's easier to transfer the knowledge to the next practitioner. Like, you're not having to explain risk, which kind of can have arbitrary definitions. It can be applied through judgment, and people can have their unique spin on it. This makes it very literal, and certainly people should be encouraged to apply their judgment. That's not what I'm getting at, but I often feel like judgment impairs good planning, and by having logic defined in your process, you effectively have good planning catered to the transaction that you're working with. Okay, so let's spin it back to those challenges that I started at the beginning of this discussion and talk specifically to how logic can address each of those challenges. So the first one around volume and just the increased volume. Certainly a lot of this is self-explanatory, right? The more you can kind of automate decisions, the more you have the appropriate response to a specific decision. You don't have to spend time thinking about it. You know what the next step is, so it makes decisions faster and therefore allows you to get through the volume faster. Secondly, this is one that we found to be very helpful with our business partners. So when we make something logical, they understand why we're doing it. It's easy for our newest team members to explain it because it's just based upon kind of inputs and like a decision tree. So we have a clear path. Oftentimes, and I've been part of this myself, our business colleagues don't really see the path that we're going in. Again, they don't practice this stuff on a day-to-day basis. So to the extent that you have a decision tree, to the extent that you have logic, it's a lot easier to explain it to them. Like, you know, A plus B equals C is easier to explain than like what is high risk. Like, it just makes it easier, it's faster, it's cleaner. I find that people are more receptive to it. Again, certainly risk is important, articulating risk is important, but when we're onboarding a vendor using the previous example, pace is also important. Like having a clear process is also important, and logic really helps you get there. Okay, and then lastly, some of you probably have large third-party risk management teams. A lot of you probably have large risk management teams. A lot of you probably have teams that are too small as well. But what I would say is, as your team grows, logic scales nicely, right? Like we have work plans that are fully curated to whatever type of vendor that we have, and certainly there could be unique scenarios that we're planning for, but that everybody's following a standard playbook for a certain vendor profile. And when you just rely on things like risk, you're gonna see a higher level of variance. And again, sometimes that's good. It's not that it's bad, but by having it defined, as part of managing the program, kind of the baseline expectations that you would expect to see for a consultant that has, access to your network, right? That what that's gonna look like every time. And through practice, I've realized that in a risk-based environment, that doesn't always look the same. Like people may do different procedures if they're not defined in a logical format. Okay, spent a lot of time on that one. Next, fourth party relationships. So the interesting thing here is I look at fourth party relationships as just like a high value transaction. That's how we approach it. So by making a lot of our onboarding work repetitive, our more experienced practitioners can focus on fourth party relationships. That's one of the areas that I want my teams to spend time. So by having logic in our other workflows, it allows fourth party relationships to be a place that we're applying judgment today. So right now, that's where a lot of my team members are spending time looking at our contracts, understanding where our fourth party relationships are, and starting to think through what could logic look like at this level, right? Like how can we start to apply logic to this level? We're not doing it today because we wanna spend our time in that space. But again, the goal here is learning from the previous interaction, learning from these high value situations so that you can make them repetitive and you can build playbooks for them. Again, today the decision is we wanna spend our time here, but in the future we wanna make it repetitive. Okay, complex third parties. So similar to kind of compounding vendorization and fourth party relationships, again, the complex third parties, what do we wanna do? We wanna spend time on this. This is great, yeah. The more complex, the more we can provide value, the more we can dig in. It's motivating for my team and I to be in situations that are very challenging from a security perspective. This isn't the work that drains us, this is the work that excites us. No, wait, we're intentionally spending our time here now. We're not spending time on third-party interactions that are very low value and repetitive. We want to spend our time in the complex ones. This is where our business is curious. Maybe it's their first time working with a vendor of a specific profile. So similar to fourth-party relationships, we are intentionally spending our time here. We're putting our experienced practitioners on it with the idea of making it repetitive over time, but also recognizing that today, this is where our business wants us involved. This is where our company wants us involved. And oh wait, the security risk is high here because of the complexity. Okay, so internal challenges, again, this is one we probably can all talk about at the bar. I really think that logic, or where I've been successful with some of these internal challenges, is showing them our logic. So showing our partners our logic so that they can augment their process. It makes our process easy to describe to other teams because we have everything logically drawn out. They can ask me the question, hey Joe, what do you do for third parties that have access to our building? And I have the whole playbook. It's all drawn out in the logic tree. I can export the logic tree, I can share it with them, and I can ask them, where should we augment privacy procedures? Where is the best part in our workflow? What additional question do you want us to include or exclude because you're asking it somewhere else? And how can I tell my team to notify you in this situation versus not notifying you of this? And the logic tree has that built into it as well. It has the handoffs built into it as well. So it fosters partnership. It makes it easier for us to work with partners in kind of risk management. And it applies a procedure to force the coordination, right? Like if you don't have this defined in a logic tree, or if you just don't have it defined in your third-party assessment program, it's less likely to be followed. It goes back to the standardization. When my team answers a question to a specific inherent risk question, and that triggers a scenario where we need to notify a compliance team, like maybe we're sharing credit card information and we need to notify our PCI team, that's one of our procedures. That's built into the logic. Are we sharing credit card information? Yes. If so, notify our PCI compliance team. And as part of kind of doing our work, our assessors have to respond to that. They have to say, yes, I notified the PCI compliance team. So again, our partners love the logic because it allows us to directly interject them. We can sit down and go through every little scenario and say, hey, where do you want to be notified? Where do you want a handoff? Where do you want us to do something that maybe we're not doing today? It makes it very easy to have those conversations. Now, I talked about partners. Another common scenario is, the business that's procuring these vendors, right? Or maybe it's the procurement team. So they're less so partnering with us on the identification of risk and dealing with security issues, but they're more so, their concern is, I want to get this vendor onboarded. And my experience has taught me that the logic really presents well to them. They can understand why we're doing certain things because it's all drawn out. And some don't care at all. Others genuinely care. And for those that genuinely care, we can just lay it all out for them. We don't have to go build, a slide deck every time they want to do it because we have the logic defined already. And it's really kind of had a nice return on the investment with our business partners as well. And then lastly, again, to me, this one's pretty straightforward. Logic is nice because it makes it easy to apply regulatory requirements. Since we're defining our action at the procedure level, I can augment the procedure level. If you're defining your action at the risk level, it's a little bit harder to define maybe a specific regulatory requirement without digging into that detail. And when I've been part of programs that were heavily based on risk, it was harder to augment these requirements. For me, I would just navigate into the decision tree, find the requirement, and put it into the specific decision tree where it's applicable. It really makes life a lot easier. Certainly, there are challenges, but I find that the logic piece of it allows for the augmentation of additional requirements. And it may not even be regulatory. It may be, your HR team wants to be notified anytime there's a new HR vendor. So I can literally just go in. If the answer to vendor type is HR, then we need to notify HR. Everything's just built into the logic tree, and it allows for the kind of increased coordination, and certainly that helps with regulatory requirements as well. Okay, I recognize I'm talking very fast. Too much coffee this morning. So some key takeaways here. I kind of beat this up early on. The necessity of having an appropriate identity. And maybe I could just elaborate on a story here. I've joined companies and my title was third-party risk management. And again, I bet you if we all talked about the definition in here amongst professionals who do this stuff every day, we probably have slightly different definitions. It's sometimes clear on definition, but with things like risk management, third parties, all these terms kind of have a little bit of a different definition depending on how you're applying it. And when you compound them all together, like I could be going left and you could think that I'm going right. So anyway, to get back to the real life example, I've joined companies before where my title was third-party risk management, but maybe I was sitting in the security organization, and the securities organization's primary risk profile is security. And oh wait, there's a privacy team that's looking at third-party reviews. There's a legal team that's looking at them. Is my scope really third-party risk management, or is it security third-party risk management, right? Like, what are we actually doing? What are we actually responsible for? And sometimes that's a humbling conversation, right? It might mean that your team is not doing everything and your team needs to focus on one profile, but I've seen that a lot, again, in kind of risk management, in kind of job definition, where the title alludes to a big scope, but when you really break it down, it's not a big scope, or it doesn't have to be a big scope, and there's a way to partner on kind of a collaborative view of, in this case, third-party risk. Secondly, the importance of aligning approach to the company's risk appetite. Again, I'm not going to beat this one up. This one's very important. I find it to be very difficult, but it's an important one, and it's important to kind of stay on the pulse. Third is differentiating between input-based activities and risk-based activities. My thesis on this is that input-based activities work great on the front end, and risk-based activities work great on the back end. And the idea is input allows you to be specific. It allows you to apply specific procedures based upon input questions. But on the back end, where you have to communicate with external parties, the ideals of risk are just a little bit easier to translate to all the line items of the work that you've done. And typically it's in alignment with the taxonomy that maybe your company's using, or maybe it's kind of a consistent industry taxonomy, right? Like terminology that just fits well in the reporting phase, but to me doesn't play as well as kind of logic and input in the execution phases. Okay. The fourth key takeaway, and through the examples, hopefully through some of this dialogue, how you can inject this into a TPRM process. That's where my examples were, but I think it's pretty clear that you can apply this to a lot of things. The idea itself isn't novel, but the doing it takes a level of time and effort. I think that's kind of another point that I wanted to layer on here. And then lastly, how each of these kind of logic scenarios can help solve some of those challenges that we all have to work through on a day-to-day basis. Okay, so applying what we learned today, this is kind of when I was thinking through like how can we action this stuff coming out of here. One is identifying where logic could improve your process. You know what, you might tell yourself, look, we don't have a lot of vendors, the risk-adjusted process we have serves us well. Maybe logic doesn't help us. But I think if you think critically through it, there is opportunities for it. Maybe it's not at scale the way I'm defining it, but you could find those low-value repetitive transactions to just build logic on, and then your team's not focused on those areas. Again, documenting your program's identity, getting buy-in on your program's identity. This one's huge. We beat that up. Collaborating on your company's risk appetite. Similarly, like being in more of those discussions, really understanding that, challenging your team to understand it too. It's one thing to understand it, it's another thing to practice it, it's another thing to articulate it. So making sure your team's fully aware of it and that you're collaborating on that. And then the first 3 months here, developing some basic decision trees. Again, it's really easy to think about this in its most advanced state, but just try to find a few if-then statements and build upon it. And I think what we found is that once you start to get the rhythm of building upon the decision tree, it becomes a really fun and interesting process for practitioners to kind of like think through these subjects and build these very complex decision trees out. And certainly you want to challenge the decision trees too, right? You might find that a decision tree didn't serve you right in a specific scenario, so there's an opportunity for just the constant retuning of decision trees. And then you can kind of see the more advanced things here in the like 6 months time frame. It's like, okay, how do we automate? How do we put this into a GRC tool? Like some of those things I recognize take time, budget, energy, but if the if-then statements work for you in the first 3 months, then you can ask yourself, do we want to invest more in this? That's the idea. So that's the presentation. I did want to open it up for some Q&A. And I certainly hope that was insightful. Any questions?
I'm just going to ask it out loud.
All right.
Old school. I appreciate this approach. Certainly, our experience with these kind of risk assessments that the business fills out, you get into these debates about like what does it mean to share data,
Yep.
And then when you try to narrow it down, it gets very technical.
Yep.
So I'm just curious to hear about your experiences in terms of how you get quality input based on this kind of approach, because I think this approach very heavily relies on having the right inputs.
So true. Honestly, working in tech, like my team and I, we have like a lot of pressure to automate, to do kind of all these like fancy kind of tech forward things. But to answer your question, and I hope this kind of came through, there's like a taxonomy that we all use that we ourselves as practitioners don't apply consistently. And certainly the business people that interact with us once a year or twice a year, they have no shot of using it correctly because the last risk person they talked to said something different than you're saying. It's really hard. So to your point, when you get a topic like, are we sharing data? In its like simplest sense, that's a very like easy question to ask, and the answer is pretty straightforward. But like to your point, it's actually a more nuanced conversation, and it's one that requires a conversation. So in those situations, we try to remove automation, and that would be what we would consider like a very value proposition. We want to have a conversation. If it's a scenario that we flag as something that has a level of taxonomy kind of definition type thing, we want to have the conversation on the front end so that we apply the right logic, to your point. Like, if we don't get those inputs correct, this is all flawed. So again, we would spend more time having conversations in that sense. Thank you, though.
Buenos dias. So I'm sure the million-dollar question is, what do I have to do to get you to share your decision tree with us? I can take you out to steak dinner, all paid, vacation. Let me know.
Yeah, maybe I should start a consulting company or something like that. But no,
Facts.
Certainly reach out to me on LinkedIn or something like that. I'm happy to share the ideals of the things that we've built because I'm proud of them. But I also know that there's lots of talented practitioners that can make it better. So I would love just to have a conversation and take a look at it, and we can talk through kind of what we've built.
Cool. Yeah, I'll find you on LinkedIn. Thanks.
Thank you.
Question, by the way, it's, as somebody who is building programs for TPR and for customers, this was very helpful. Thank you very much. Question that I have is more around outcomes for the partner side. Mm-hmm. So as you said, with input-based, the number of questions being asked can be reduced really kind of much more contextual based on what we're trying to do.
Yes.
What is the feedback you receive from your partner ecosystem about that reduction? Because that's where I find a lot of customers are not getting the answers from their vendors because they're like, I cannot answer 200 questions.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, what is the feedback or is the outcome you receive from your vendors?
It's funny, and I have two answers to this question. One is they obviously like it because we're asking less questions. It's less burden on their teams. But it's funny, and that was my leading theory going into it. We're asking less questions. Our partners are going to love this. We're asking thoughtful questions, which I feel like should be foundational in our work. But it's not the case for all third-party risk management teams. There's people are getting full SIGs and maybe not asking the questions that are specifically concerning to them. But we actually got some pushback from our vendors too, and I wanted to share this. A lot of our vendors have standard packages. And sometimes our questions are buried in those standard packages, and we have no problem finding them, but that actually kind of slows us down. Like, now we have to look at this big clunky document and find things, so that's been one challenge. And then secondly, sometimes the documentation that they provide is more enterprise level security control. It's not specific to the transaction that we're doing with that vendor. So it has also challenged us in that way to have a more detailed conversation with these vendors. And in some cases, they have to invest more time dealing with us, even though we're asking less questions. So it's kind of a double edge. Like, some love it because we're asking thoughtful questions. Others that have kind of more mature response programs, we're kind of pushing in areas maybe of more focus that they don't have the detailed answer that we want in their brochure or whatever.
Maybe like the smaller vendors might appreciate that more.
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly right. So there's been a lot of benefit, but there's also challenge with doing it that way as well. Cool.
Thank you for the very inspiring talk. I understand that you put your focus and scrutiny on the high-risk profile cases, but what about the vast volume cases of low-risk, repetitive? Do you have a sort of standardized approach which has, let's say, a low entry barrier, standardized approach to cover that broadness, which would take probably a lot of effort to let them go through a very specialized question and answer process. Do you have this kind of standardization?
Yeah, absolutely we do. The terminology is a little bit different though. So since we're using inputs and we're not applying risk, we don't look at it as like a low risk vendor. We look at it as what's the input persona. And if it has lots of input persona that we would, as an industry, would say is a lower risk vendor, our procedures are prescribed specific to those inputs, which would probably have some general alignment to risk, right? The way we're building the logic tree is not to do more procedures for the lower risk vendors. So as the persona becomes lower risk, the level of procedures that we do is tailored to that. So again, we don't use the terminology risk, we use the inputs, but those inputs tailor the procedures specific to that type of engagement. I hope that helped. Cool. Any other questions?
Here.
Oh, thank you. All right, yes, perfect.
So thank you. Super interesting approach. I've worked with both, with the customized questionnaire and then with the Cloud Security Alliance questionnaire. I have had both reactions from the vendors and from the business.
Yes.
But I think that one of the benefits of doing a customized questionnaire is the analysis of the answers.
Yes.
Because
yeah.
the Cloud Security Alliance is so huge. How do we navigate and make sense of all those answers? Versus a customized approach, you have the logic there to give you the answer. So amazing.
Yeah, it really has, if you don't mind me interjecting, it really has worked well in that sense. When I joined the team, we were getting full SIGs, which is great. It's a lot of meaningful security intelligence on our vendors, but like the burden of review is also high. So not having that logic tree early on in the process results in less value work downstream.
So super good. How do you mentioned that once you go through that, you communicate to the business again using risk?
Yes. We go
How
back
do
to
you do that mapping? At the end, once you have the responses, or from the beginning of the?
From the beginning. So based upon the logic inputs, we do render a risk score. We don't use that risk score to drive procedures, but we use that inherent risk score to communicate to business stakeholders, to the third parties. And then similarly, when we get through the residual risk exercise, we get through our assessment procedures, we'll have the same thing. And I'm getting the stop thing yelling at me right now. So.
Another question, quickly. After onboarding, what do you do? Maintenance going forward to make sure that they are doing what they're saying that they
Yeah,
do?
so we apply logic to our reassessment program. We apply logic to our offboarding programs. There's variances in maturity in all of these, but the idea is that the idea of logic is applied to those as well. Yeah. Thank you, by the way.
Excellent.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.